really relevant right now. We put this slideshow together about a month ago, and it's outdated already as far as a lot of things, as you'll see as we go through. But it just emphasizes the importance we have to place on being prepared for whatever comes along next, and have to rethink our engineering approach to different problems. You know, engineers like things to be very certain, and you'd be able to follow codes or requirements or calculations, and this throws a lot of that out the window as things are continually changing as we go along with how our world is changing with natural cases. Things are becoming more harrowing every day, as we all know, and we're in this lockdown. But let's take a look at, let's see. Here we go. So first thing that comes up is hurricanes, and the first line is outdated because this year we had started with Tropical Storm Arthur, and now we're through Hurricane Iota down in the Caribbean. So we've added a few more storms to this. Estimates in October was $25 to $29 billion in damages as a result of those storms. And then you just go through a whole litany of storms every year. Hurricane Michael with $15 billion, Hurricane Florence with $18 billion, Hurricane Harvey with $125 billion in damages, Hurricane Irma, Superstorm Sandy, which we in New York were really familiar with, and Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans. That was $125 billion in damages in 2005. So hurricanes are high on the list of what we have to be prepared for as we go forward, particularly in coastal areas, but also inland as well. So in addition to hurricanes, we have tsunamis. We don't think of them too much about here, but you have Fukushima in 2011, $199 billion in damages. And essentially it wrecked a nuclear power plant, which created environmental and human damage as a result of radiation leaks from that plant. And then the tsunami in Indonesia in 2004, $19.9 billion in damages, but I think over 200,000 people were killed as a result of it. So a great cost in human life, and how do we look at these things and prepare for them in the future? Right. We have the wildfires, the Western U.S. wildfires this past summer. Estimate was $20 billion in damages. 2 years ago was the California Camp Fire. 3 years ago was other wildfires in California. Again, a continuing problem. How do we plan our infrastructure to be able to deal with these issues without tremendous damage and also without loss of human life? The flooding, 2018, the Ohio River. January 2018, Boston and Cape Cod were flooded severely from rainfall. And then in 2018, as a result of Hurricane Florence, South Carolina had a dozen dam failures, which flooded out large areas. So again, things are happening out there that's stressing our engineering designs beyond what our normal design capabilities are. These are all extreme events that we're talking about, and how do we handle them? And last but not least, all of a sudden, we're presented with COVID-19. Projected loss in GDP of about $20 trillion. Again, this is out of date. Current fatalities due to COVID, it's pushing 250,000 now. And the global number is I think 1.5 million, something. So continuing concerns. And now you start to say, okay, well, what does engineering have to do with COVID? But if you look, some of the items we have to talk about, new design criteria for HVAC systems. Hospitals are now looking for 12 turnovers in a room of air in their HVAC systems rather than the normal design of 6. Well, how do we design this? Do we design it with a system that you can essentially flip a switch, change it from 12 to 6 or 6 to 12, depending on the situation? There's no need to have 12 turnovers under normal conditions when you don't have COVID or some other type of disease going around, but you do need it other times. Why spend the money for power all the time? So how do we make these systems more resilient? You're going to need these MERV 13 filters, portable air filters, UV disinfecting lights, all kinds of different technologies are coming up to control the airflow in hospitals, and you're going to see it in schools, you're seeing it in subway trains, railroad trains, like airplanes, everything else. Changing social distancing regulations and policies, how we design our cities. You know, do we design wider sidewalks now so people don't have to pass each other so closely? Dining areas in roads and sidewalks. We've seen that popping up in New York City and other cities where they've essentially shut down thoroughfares to allow diners to keep the economy going. Converting streets into plazas. Or do we, you know, when you're designing a city, you're designing, you know, college campuses and the like, do you increase more plaza space so people can distance between them and people can get outside and you kind of move people from inside to outside. So a whole new concepts with COVID as well on how we design our projects. And it's all part of incorporating resiliency into those projects. And, you know, there's a discussion, is it resiliency now or is it adaptability? Whatever you want to call it, it's engineering have to change how we look at things and do our designs. We'll talk about the resiliency cycle, and it's a continually learning process that we have as we go into this. At the very top, you prepare for something happening. If it's a flood or coastal flooding event, you're gonna, you know, people, okay, we're gonna put sandbags out to protect buildings or the interior from buildings, or increase the height of the levees with sandbags to protect your area. Once you prepare for the response, because usually you have some advance notice of these things, then you go into your response. Okay, it happens. You have a flood, you have a hurricane comes through, 8 inches of rainfall, 12 inches of rainfall, something like that, and you get the situation we show on the right under the response slide. Here you've got, okay, now how do we recover from this thing? How do we get people out of there? How do we evacuate? How do we save people's lives, essentially, in these situations? How do we respond to it? Afterwards, once the situation has resolved itself, does the cleanup. How do we go? We've got to clean up. There's going to be a whole mess, as you can well know. Is it either people, if their houses got inundated with floodwaters, they're going to be taking their soggy couches and throwing them out on the curb, as well as stuff that just comes down river and ends up on your front lawn that has to be removed, or clogging streets and the like. So you clean up. Then you go into reconstruction. How do we essentially build it back better? You see on the top, these are homes that have been essentially flooded out. They were built within the floodplain or down below the floodplain, and we reconstruct better with homes that meet FEMA requirements, putting the first floor above the floodplain, having essentially breakout areas beneath the home where you can store things, but you can't. It's not considered a habitable space. Essentially raising the houses up. You see that in many coastal communities. And then also you deal with robust infrastructure. This is a photo of the floodgates on the Midtown Tunnel into New York City. The tunnel itself got flooded out during Sandy, and huge cost to repair. All the electrical work got just completely destroyed. HVAC systems are down there. The whole tunnel largely had to be rebuilt, and to protect it in the future, they put these massive floodgates on top of the tunnel. So you've got this resiliency cycle. They talk about generals always fighting the last war. Generally, as engineers, when we get in these situations, we're always fighting the last catastrophe. So we think we're planning for the next catastrophe is going to look like the last one. And that's not always the case. It's going to be. So we've got to be thinking more outside the box on what's going to be happening next. And you have to have a plan. We talk about critical infrastructure. We've done work for hospitals, and there your resilient design has to be part of a plan on what you're going to do with the hospital. Are you going to evacuate the hospital? Are you going to try and keep the hospital operating during the period? Some of it depends on what the storm is going to look like. You know, if our design storm is 6 feet, we may be able to protect the hospital and keep it operational. If the design storm is 12 feet or 10 feet, that may not be the case. We might have to say, look, we can't afford to build to this type of event, and we're going to evacuate. We're going to say, okay, essentially run away when something gets that bad. So there's got to be a plan, and the design has to match the plan. And that's something, as engineers, we've got to work with essentially the clients, the people who are going to be using these facilities, to have them understand what the limitations of our design is, as well as have them know that the engineers just aren't going to protect this completely. We've got to understand what our limitations are and how we respond. So this resiliency cycle, and then it just keeps going back. You're going to have an event, and you're going to learn from that event, and then you're going to work on a new plan and look at how you're going to build back better and get this robust infrastructure. So it goes around and around, continually learning as things change. And you'll see as we go through, there's a lot of uncertainty out there onto what things are going to look like as we go into the future. Okay, so what's going on with climate change? We're going to look at this. We have temperature versus time here. And this goes back to 1850. And we've got land surface temperature, we've got sea surface temperature, we've got marine air temperatures. And you can see from about 1850 to probably around 1900, they were actually lower than the long-term norm. And then around 1900, they kind of started a steady increase. But it wasn't until kind of like a 1980 or so in here where you started to see these temperatures going consistently above the norm. So you've got a long-term trend of increasing temperatures, but now you're seeing it going fairly well above the norm. And that's going to be a key factor. And so that's something we'll watch. And that's kind of like the precursor of what happens, okay? Then we're looking at sea level, right? Same thing. This goes back to about 1875. Again, kind of a steady rise of sea level. And on the bottom, you see the Arctic sea ice dropping down. Increase in sea level isn't just related to glaciers calving off out of Antarctica or Greenland. As the temperature rise, we all know that the water is expanding as a result of the rise in temperature. So you've got a combination of ice melting and contributing to more water into the system, as well as, because of the temperature increasing, the water expanding, and you're giving you sea level rise as a result of that. So it's not exactly one simple linear equation. Okay, this is now starting to look at projections, and this is where the uncertainty comes in. So we can look at the past. And so less than 2010 or so, we know what's happening. And then projections were started to be made about what's going to happen into the future. And there's a number of different models out there that give us different projections. And you can see it's ranging from this of about 1 degree rise, 1 degree centigrade rise in median temperature, to a little over 4 degrees rise in temperature. Just two models looking at the same thing. And then you've got uncertainty around those models, right, which can bring it up to about 5.5 degrees centigrade. So huge range bottom is, you know, 0.2 maybe degrees centigrade, and top is 5.5 degrees centigrade. That's a huge change in the projections. And how do we deal with that uncertainty, particularly when we're designing things? You know, we're easily, as civil engineers, designing things that have to survive until 2050, and many of them have to survive to year 2100. So this is what we're wrestling with in the future, and that's the hard part, and to some extent the fun part, on seeing what's going to happen. And you can see the models stay pretty consistent, at least up until about 2040, 2050. You start to get a significant deviation, and then when you get way out there, it starts to get further apart. Okay, and we have the projections in sea level. Same deal. When you get out to 2100, you're talking an average of, and this is in meters, so this is about 0.45 meters. So we're talking, what, 16 inches or so. And on the lower model and the upper model, we're talking about 0.75 meters. So we're talking 30 inches or so of sea level rise. And we come up to the top on the uncertainty area, and we're talking to a meter of sea level rise, about 39, 40 inches. So again, a wide variation in what we've got to design for as we look to the future. And how do we handle that? And you know, and we may be handling it at one point. You know, we can say we can get to 2080 with the design we have, and after that time, that design is maybe obsolete, depending on what reality shows us and how this gets changed. Okay, so the times are changing. Old school engineering, what they taught, you know, they taught me way back when in college was everything is going to be the same as it was in the past. You have a 100-year storm, and that's based upon looking at past data, and you say, okay, this particular storm is going to have a 0.01 chance of occurrence in the future. It had a point. It occurred once in 100 years in the past. It'll occur, so you know, once in 100 years in the future. At least that's statistically. Well, that doesn't work anymore because this assumes, the stationarity assumes that the mean stays the same, and everything in the future is going to look like it did in the past. That's not the case. So this mean is changing with time now. All of a sudden, this mean keeps moving up. So it's a moving a target. So we've got to look at the future when we make our projections and we do our design work. What's going to happen? So it's a key aspect. You know, you design for, you know, you look at a FEMA flood elevation of a 100-year flood elevation now. Well, that might not be a 1 in 100 in the future. That may be 1 in 50 or 1 in 25. So you've got to be careful in your design so that you incorporate that uncertainty. And you know, New York State is projecting up to a 20% increase in rainfall in the eastern portion of the state. We know we've got water levels rising in the Great Lakes. Some of it's part of this increase in rainfall that we're seeing, and it'll get worse. And we also know we're seeing more extreme events than we have in the past. So all that has to be taken into account as we go towards the future. Looking at resiliency efforts, 4 things we look at. Particularly, this is for critical infrastructure. The scale of the impact. How big is the storm going to be? What's the flood levels going to look like? How much rainfall are we going to get in these extreme events now? You know, before 500-year storm may have been 12 inches of rainfall. Maybe it's going to be 15 inches of rainfall as we go into the future. So, and how does that impact the particular location we're dealing with? Is our location up high enough so it's not a problem and we're okay? Or is it a problem? And how do we have to deal with it? So what's that scale of the impact on the particular facility? And how long is it going to impact the facility? Superstorm Sandy was a unique storm. Most hurricanes come and blow through rather rapidly. One tidal cycle is kind of like the usual thing. You know, how does it hit compared to high tide? Superstorm Sandy was 2 tidal cycles, so it just hung there for a while. And we're seeing more and more of these storms make landfall and hang there. Irma, last year in the Bahamas, did just that. You know, it went and sat over Grand Bahama Island for a couple days. And that has a much greater impact than just kind of like blowing through. This is just a continual flooding of areas and a continual wind and rainfall that essentially wears down infrastructure. It's not necessarily designed to last. 100-mile-an-hour winds for 2 days is different than 100-mile-an-hour winds for a couple hours. Things just actually wear down. Then the likelihood of impact. Is it going to hit a particular location? And how frequently? That's where we talk about, is it a 100-year storm? Is it a 500-year storm? What's the chances of it actually impacting a particular location that we're trying to evaluate? And then the vulnerability. How vulnerable are the structures themselves? One interesting. We did a study for a hospital in Staten Island, and it was kind of on a hill or a high point, and the area around it would flood before the hospital flood. So that, when you talk about evacuation and having a plan, once the water got to the door of the hospital, it was too late because there was 6 feet of water all around the hospital, so you couldn't evacuate. So you had to make a plan well in advance of, we're going to evacuate, we just can't wait and see. If the projection is 6 feet, then you better be planning accordingly. Again, these vulnerability, how vulnerable is a location? Is it right on the water? Is it at higher elevation? What's likely to hit it? Sometimes you're looking at wind as opposed to water. Is it on the top of a hill where it could be subject to high winds, that type of thing? You gotta identify the critical infrastructure. There's all kinds of different approaches to resiliency. New York City, Manhattan is looking at the big U, they call it, putting essentially a storm wall around southern Manhattan in a U shape to essentially protect the lower lying areas of southern Manhattan. There's others where they're looking at floodgates across New York Harbor, running from Breezy Point to Sandy Hook to essentially prevent floodwaters, tidal waters from coming up into New York Harbor. There are large-scale regional approaches. Another approach that we've been looking at is, let's protect the critical infrastructure. You're going to have people losing homes and things like that, but let's make sure we've got hospitals going, make sure we've got power plants so they don't lose power. Water and wastewater treatment. Wastewater was a big deal during Sandy. A lot of treatment plants are on the shoreline, built there a long time ago, and they got flooded out, were shut down, and had to bypass raw sewage out. High-density housing areas, particularly areas where housing the elderly or people who are can't easily evacuate quickly, and how do you protect them, or do you just protect the housing units themselves so that people can move back quickly, so they're not displaced for a long period of time? All the housing has to be essentially rebuilt. Transportation networks. We saw with Sandy, subways, tunnels, bridges, causeways in low-lying areas get washed out, so you get areas that used to be serviced by a causeway all now of a sudden become an island. How do we protect those and we do that? We've seen a lot of instances where with the rising sea level, areas that would only flood out occasionally now flood out, so they would flood out maybe once a month on a new moon. You'd have water in the street and, kind of lived with it. Now they're flooding out 2, 3, 4 times a month with rising sea level. So it becomes more of an issue. And you've got all this infrastructure. You've got sewers beneath it, both storm sewers and sanitary sewers, and roadways that you may have to raise up to make them functional. We do a risk analysis. Excuse me. And we've got to look at the cost of resiliency. It needs to be less than the cost of damage times the probability of the damages. So, take, for example, Hurricane Katrina was $125 billion in damages. And he's saying it's a 50-year storm, which is probably much less likely than that, but it may end up becoming more probable. So you just take 125 billion times 0.02, gives you $2.5 billion. Essentially, it's a yearly investment you could make, and still make it worthwhile for the protection that you have. So you can quantify this. It's not, and then and it doesn't include in that calculation the protection of human life, which is another issue to deal with. This is a case study, and when we talk about how we design resiliently, this is what happened in New Orleans under Katrina, and this is the levees in the area what was called the 9th Ward, and this was a low-income area, broad area. It was built behind the levee. And during Katrina, the levee failed, and essentially wiped out. And New Orleans lost 2,000 people in Katrina, and a good bit of it was in this area, where essentially it was under 12 feet of water. So this is where you saw the pictures of people on the roofs of their homes and the like being evacuated. Probably one of the biggest disasters. And kind of engineering in action, this is the biggest disaster on why the rationale was not good, and they really didn't look at it as a resilient type of situation. This is the configuration of the levee. It's got sheet piles. It's got what they call an eye wall, which is essentially an I-beam. They've got an earthen levee here, and this eye wall is put down into the levee. The whole, geotech analysis on supporting that, and under normal operations, the river level is here. It's not above the levee, and everyone's nice and happy. Now, this levee and the sheet pile wall and the eye wall was designed for a 100-year storm, and so everyone, they did the analysis and said, okay, this is going to be the level of a 100-year storm right here. And there was no consideration for what happens if you have more than a 100-year storm. They said, the design is for a 100-year storm. We're going to fund for a 100-year storm. And that's it. Okay. And because they did that, they didn't put any cladding or armoring behind the levee wall. Okay, so this was just like a flat sand levee, and there wasn't anything behind it. So you got to the 100-year storm, and everything was great. You go above the 100-year storm, and the water comes over the top of the levee, right, and then drops like 10 feet. Okay. And what it did, because there was no armoring behind the levee wall, it eroded the levee behind the sheet pile, the eye wall. And that then, eliminated the resistance of the soil behind it, and the levee collapsed. Then, when the levee collapsed, then you got all this water comes pouring through into the neighborhood. Okay, so what the message I want to get across is we've got to start looking to not just designing to a 100-year storm or designing to a certain aspect. We have to say, okay, what happens if it's worse than we thought it might be, and how do we protect from a catastrophic failure? It can fail, but let it fail gently and not catastrophically, where people just get inundated with the water in a very quick period of time. See, and that, just going back to that, that's what happened here. Design considerations. This here shows that kind of like that big U at the lower Manhattan, where they're looking to create a seawall that kind of fits in with the neighborhood, and using parkland and the like to make it so it doesn't look like a prison, essentially. But things we have to consider now: river flooding, coastal flooding, rainfall events, high wind events. We was it 2 days ago or yesterday? We had tornado warnings here on Long Island. That's largely unheard of. And all of a sudden, people were told to go to a room with no windows in some areas. So something completely new and different. Wildfires, groundwater, increasing groundwater levels, dealing with coastal flooding. If we're putting up a wall, we've also got to understand that the water will want to go under that wall, and how do we design the depth of the wall to essentially prevent the groundwater from upheaving on the other side of the wall. Loss of power. What happens if we lose power? So we don't have a catastrophic situation where we've got no power, and then all of a sudden our sewer pumps don't work, or our water pumps don't work, or we lose refrigeration or whatever it is. So how do we account for that? So there's a whole bunch of design considerations we have now. Some are not relevant to a particular area, others are particularly relevant to other areas, and many of them are relevant to the area. So we've got to look at all of these in our future designs. We're looking at design flood elevations. So we've got the base flood elevation, which is typically what you get off a FEMA map. 100-year storm base flood elevation is 6 feet, say. The design flood elevation is what we're designing above that base flood elevation. The GOSA requirements for Governor's Office of Stormwater Recovery, or Storm Recovery, has recommendations or requirements. They're talking the flood of record plus 4 feet. So if you were looking at Sandy, for instance, and its flood elevation was about 6 feet, you're designing for 10 foot of flood elevation. Another aspect is to look at the 500-year flood instead of just the 100-year flood. Another is the base flood, the 100-year storm plus 5 feet. The analysis we've done, this is, when you follow this strictly, it's up around 10 feet elevation on much of Long Island. That's a pretty high elevation, FEMA requirements for homes on the beach, the Barrier Beach and things like that, are typically now 10 feet first floor elevation. And the design flood elevation is designed to incorporate the base flood plus wave action plus uncertainty related to sea level rise. New York City DEP is using somewhere from 26 to 30 inches of sea level rise in their analysis for resiliency for wastewater treatment plants in New York City. So there's quite a bit of factor of safety added to these designs that we're doing these days to account for that. So this is much more than you're used to looking at. And this shows Superstorm Sandy flood inundation. This is a hospital here. This is a nursing home here. Okay, you can see the nursing home was essentially completely surrounded with water. These are residential neighborhoods on both sides. They were completely flooded out. You know, some worse than others. But a lot of homes were damaged. You can see there's canals that you know, go up into these residential areas that certainly don't help the situation as far as elevation. And the projected, when you look at the GOSA requirements, would have up in this neighborhood here the projected flood lines. So significant amount of flooding happens, and this was about elevation 6 or so, which was Sandy. Green infrastructure. This is an example in Florida. This is a condo complex right on the water. They have mangrove, essentially part of mangrove swamp remains between the berm here and the water. This is Indian River Lagoon, and this mangrove helps cut down wave action that would help to erode this, and also protects. You know, one of the things we have to look at in these storms is there's a boat or a barge or something come off its mooring and end up floating into this during the storm and start wiping things out or wiping out the designed infrastructure that we have. So this is critical. So then beyond that, armoring, stone armoring to protect the berm. And then this is elevation about probably 10 or a little bit more, because this is first floor elevation for habitable units. And it is designed according to FEMA. So that's you know, a good example of resilient design, and it incorporates natural aspects as well as engineered aspects, as well as you know, getting the correct elevation and making sure everything's works together. And I think that's what we got. We can open it up for some question and answer, and then we do have some questions that everyone has to answer as part of getting your PDHs. So why don't we open it up to questions first, and then we can do it. Whatever you prefer, Scott.
Do folks have any questions? If you let me know in the chat, I can unmute you. I just have one right now. Was a question about, like, I guess relative to like New York City, you talked about sea level rise up to 1 meter, but how do we address storm surges that can be many feet?
Yeah, that's part of. We go back a few slides. This actually shows part of that big U that they're talking about here. So this is designed to take that 6 or 8 foot of storm surge in southern Manhattan area. Also, flood doors on the tunnels, that type of thing. So there are designs being worked on to do that and take care of the storm surge as well. So yeah, they're taking, to answer, I think what I'm looking at, that design flood elevation incorporates the storm surge as part of the base flood elevation, and then they add the 28 inches or 30 inches on top of that to account for sea level rise. So both are accounted for. Did that answer the question?
I didn't get a follow-up, so I'm going to say yes. So,
you got a thumbs up?
do we have any other questions? I did get one other question. Someone asked, could you provide examples of resiliency design for healthcare facilities?
Sure. We've put barriers or berms around the facility or around a portion of the facility to protect the building. You can also incorporate parking and access into that so the building can stay operational during a storm. Many of these facilities have, the one I talked about in Staten Island, the building itself, we had designed a flood wall around it. And there I think we actually had hydraulic gates because you have to close off the entrances and exits to the parking and things like that, and to the building to protect that. Others we've just used a berm because maybe the front portion of the property would be below the flood level, and the rear portion would not. So you protect the front portion like this big U type of thing, and you could still have traffic access and parking to the hospital. You protect it that way, so it stays operational. It doesn't have to be evacuated during an event. We've used a lot of the berms or some kind of wall, depending on the height, with these aluminum flood planks you can put in at the entrances. So if you've got a doorway, you have a wall as opening in the wall, and you put these flood planks in when the storm event is approaching as part of your process in securing the building. So there's a number of different ways to do it.
Someone had a question about a more affordable alternative could be like the water inflated dams, but is there always enough time to react to get those in place and filled ahead of a storm event?
Generally with hurricanes, we believe there is, because they we've gotten pretty good at tracking them these days, and usually have multiple days notice that there may be an issue, so that they can get prepared. And part of your plan is, okay, there's a chance of it occurring, and 5 days before we get all our flood planks out of storage, get them to the site, because many times may not be room at the site to store these things. So get them on site. 2 days out, you make the call whether you're going to evacuate or not. The day before, then you get your evacuation done, you put your flood planks in, you secure the building up, that type of thing. So it's all both combination of engineering and operations on how you plan for these things. There have been, we've had some microbursts of rainfall where you get 6 inches of rainfall in an hour, something like that. That is a little more problematic. And so you want to incorporate other designs, more robust stormwater systems. Do you have, your stormwater system may be designed for a 2-inch rainfall, which is town code, but it doesn't, it overflows when you get 6 inches, and you've got to deal with it. We've got projects where we contain the 2 inches and then overflow into a pump station and then pump it away to some place where it's not going to be an issue. So that's one of the ways to deal with it. Flood-proof doors are another thing in areas that are prone to flooding, particularly around a hospital or some things where you just close the door and lock it, and it seals. It keeps flood waters from coming in. One thing to remember with a lot of buildings is, although you might not think so, they aren't watertight a lot of times. We've had instances where if you've got a brick facade, they've got weep holes in there to drain moisture from between the brick and the block, and water gets in there, and you can get water getting through the block. It's not impermeable. So you have some of these other concerns you have to be careful of. And we've done evaluations on block to determine whether it can withstand some of the flooding that you might expect structurally.
Very interesting. Do we have any other questions before we close out our session today? I am not seeing any additional questions, so I thank everyone for joining today. Thank you, Dr. Grosser, for putting this on. Really appreciate it.
Sure, thank you for your time.